How calm can be powerful in attracting everything you desire. Nobody ever told you that staying calm was a form of dominance. They told you to speak up, push harder, fight back, react faster. They were wrong. There is a specific type of person that walks into a crisis, a difficult conversation, a collapsing deal, a relationship on the edge, and instead of reacting, they go completely still. And somehow, inexplicably, the room shifts, the energy changes, the other person starts to shrink. Without saying a single word, this person has already won. You have seen this happen. You have probably spent years wondering how to become that person. Here is what nobody explained. That stillness is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with. It is a precise, trainable psychological mechanism, one that Marcus Aurelius documented in a private journal 2,000 years ago, that neuroscience has only recently been able to explain, and that almost no one alive today is using correctly. In the next 12 minutes, you are going to discover exactly why every method you have ever tried to stay calm under pressure has been making you weaker, and the one internal shift that turns your composure into the most commanding force in any room you enter. Not a breathing exercise, not a mindset hack, something far more specific and far more permanent. But first, consider this. What if the reason you keep losing your calm at the exact wrong moment has nothing to do with your discipline, your stress levels, or your circumstances, and everything to do with one biological pattern you have never been shown how to override? 2,000 years ago, a man responsible for 70 million lives, surrounded by war, betrayal, and daily catastrophe, wrote in a private journal he never intended for anyone to read. He was not writing for an audience. He was writing to survive. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And buried in those private pages is a framework for psychological composure so precise that it reads less like ancient philosophy and more like an operating manual for the human nervous system. Pay attention. What comes next will permanently change how every room responds to your presence. The biological signature of authority. Think about the last time you watched someone lose their composure in a high-stakes moment. A meeting that went sideways. A conversation that escalated past the point of reason. A negotiation where one side suddenly quacked. You did not need anyone to explain what happened. You felt it. The moment a person loses their internal stillness, everything about them changes. Their voice tightens. Their movements become small and hurried. Their eyes stop holding steady. And in that moment, without a single word being exchanged about power, the room has already decided who is in charge. This is not a social observation. It is biology. When a person is overwhelmed by their own stress response, they broadcast it involuntarily, continuously, and in ways that every other human being in the room registers at a level beneath conscious thought. The body does not lie. And at 40, 50, or 55 years old, you have seen enough of life to know that the people who command genuine respect are almost never the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones who seem entirely unbothered by the very things that are visibly consuming everyone else. Marcus Aurelius understood this not as theory, but as daily practice. He wrote that we must not be hurried away by the appearance of things. That the first discipline is to observe without being captured by what you observe. That discipline, lived in the body, in the breath, in the steadiness of the gaze, is what separates the person who merely survives a difficult moment from the person who owns it. Every involuntary twitch, every rushed answer, every moment you feel silence because you cannot tolerate it, each one is a small signal to the people around you that the situation is larger than you are, and people adjust their treatment of you accordingly, often without realizing they are doing it. The good news is that this signature is trainable. It is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming so settled in your own foundation that external pressure simply does not find purchase. When you master this, you do not need to announce your authority. You simply carry it, and the room responds. But physical composure is only the surface of a much deeper strategy. The real power begins in the gap between what happens and how you respond to it. The arbitrage of the delayed reaction. Most people operate like a lit fuse. The moment something provocative reaches them, a dismissive comment, an unexpected piece of bad news, a challenge to their position, they ignite. Instantly, without choosing to. And in that instant of automatic reaction, They surrender the most valuable tactical resource available to them, time. Here is what that costs you at this stage of life. You have built something. A career, a reputation, a set of relationships that took decades to develop. And a single unguarded reaction, at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong person, can quietly undo years of careful construction, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that one crack in a foundation eventually determines the fate of the entire structure. The person who masters the delayed reaction is practicing what can only be called emotional arbitrage. While everyone else is spending their energy in the heat of the moment, this person is buying time, observing, letting the initial wave pass. And by the time they respond, they are operating from reason rather than reflex, which means their words carry the weight of someone who chose them, not someone who was ambushed by them. Seneca wrote that the greatest remedy for anger is delay, not suppression, delay. Because when you wait, the chemistry of the moment changes. The initial surge subsides, and what was a crisis seconds ago reveals itself, more often than not, as something far smaller than it first appeared. This is the art of the person who has genuinely earned their composure. Not the person performing calm while internally boiling, but the person who has trained themselves to insert a real pause between stimulus and response. That pause is not passivity. It is a laboratory. In it, you observe the actual situation rather than your emotional interpretation of it. You identify what actually requires a response, and you choose your words with the precision of someone who understands that silence, used correctly, is more powerful than anything you could say. The next time a situation tries to pull you off center, the pause is your first and most decisive move. What you discover inside that pause leads directly to an understanding of what your reactions have truly been costing you. The bankruptcy of emotional indebtedness. There is a form of financial recklessness that no one ever talks about in those terms, and you have almost certainly been practicing it without realizing it. Every time you allow a minor frustration to consume your afternoon, every time you replay a difficult conversation until midnight, every time you spend genuine mental energy on a provocation that will be entirely forgotten by next week, you are making a withdrawal from the only account that actually funds your quality of life. Think of your mental and emotional energy not as a mood, but as capital. It is the actual resource you need to do your best work, maintain your most important relationships, and make the kind of clear-headed decisions that determine the direction of the years ahead. When you drain that capital on things that do not return value, on reactions, on rumination, on the low-level hum of constant irritation, you arrive at the moments that genuinely matter, running on empty. Seneca wrote that people guard their personal property with fierce care, but when it comes to their time, they are the most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be sparing. The same is true of attention, of equanimity, of the steady, clear-headed presence that allows you to be fully available for the situations that deserve your best. At this point in your life, you have likely already experienced what it feels like to make a poor decision from a depleted state, to say something you regret because you were too exhausted to choose your words carefully, to miss an opportunity because your attention was still occupied by something that happened 3 days ago. That is not a character flaw. It is the predictable result of emotional bankruptcy, and it is entirely reversible. When you stop the leak, the balance begins to rebuild. You start making decisions from surplus rather than deficit. You stop settling for less because you finally have the internal resources to hold out for more. The Stoics called this self-possession, and it is less a virtue than a practical advantage that compounds over time. Once you stop bleeding energy into the void, something remarkable begins to happen to the way you perceive the world around you. The algorithm of conscious serendipity. You have almost certainly had this experience. You are in the middle of a stressful period. Your mind is running at full volume, and somehow you keep missing things. You walk past an opportunity without recognizing it. You overlook a detail that, in a calmer moment, would have been obvious. You have a conversation with someone, and later realize they were offering you exactly what you needed, and you were too preoccupied to notice. This is not distraction. It is a documented biological phenomenon. When the nervous system is operating in a prolonged stress state, the brain activates a survival filter that narrows your perceptual field to threats and urgencies. In a genuine emergency, this is useful. In the ordinary conditions of your daily life, a career, a relationship, a decision that requires nuance, it is a liability. You are literally not seeing the full picture. Not because the information is absent, but because your system has been calibrated to filter it out. A calm mind operates differently. When the internal noise subsides, your perceptual bandwidth expands. You begin to notice what was always there but previously invisible. The subtle signal in a conversation, the pattern in a situation that repeats, the solution to a problem that had been obscured by the anxiety surrounding it. What the world calls luck or good timing is, more often than not, simply the byproduct of a mind clear enough to register what others are too reactive to see. Marcus Aurelius described the well-ordered mind as a spring of clear water, one that keeps flowing regardless of what is thrown into it, because the clarity is structural, not circumstantial. When you cultivate that structural clarity, you stop experiencing the world as a series of random obstacles and begin to see it as a navigable system with visible patterns. This is not mystical. It is the practical result of a nervous system that is no longer consuming its own resources. You stop guessing and start observing. You stop hoping for breaks and start noticing the ones that were already there. The question is no longer whether opportunities exist. They always have. The question is whether you will be still enough to see them when they arrive. That stillness, however, requires a specific kind of space that most people have never been taught to create deliberately. The architecture of the mental vacuum. Here is a pattern that affects almost every high-functioning person past 40. The schedule is full. The inputs are constant, and somewhere beneath the productivity there is a quiet awareness, the genuine original thought, the kind that used to come easily, has become increasingly rare. Not because the capacity is gone, because there is no longer any space for it to arrive. The mind does not produce its clearest work under continuous input. It produces its clearest work in the silence that follows. Input, in the unscheduled, inoptimized, deliberately empty moments that most busy people have systematically eliminated from their lives. Every podcast filling a commute. Every phone checked during a meal. Every moment of potential stillness converted into consumption is a moment where something more important could not surface because there was no room for it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that nowhere can a person find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in their own soul. He was not describing a personality type. He was describing a practice, the deliberate cultivation of internal space as a functional strategy, not a luxury. When you create genuine vacancy in your day, not scheduled relaxation, but real, unstructured emptiness, several things happen that cannot occur any other way. Complex problems that your conscious mind has been circling begin to resolve themselves, because the deeper processing that was always running underneath the noise finally has room to surface. Decisions that felt difficult become clear. Priorities that were obscured by busyness become obvious. The voice of your own judgment, which had been drowned out by the constant volume of input, becomes audible again. For someone at your stage of life, this is not a minor adjustment. It is a structural recalibration. The most important decisions still ahead of you, about your work, your relationships, the shape of the years remaining, deserve to be made from that place of clarity, not from the fragmented, overstimulated state that passes for normal in a life without deliberate silence. The space you create is not empty. It is where your best thinking lives. And when you begin to inhabit that space consistently, something changes in the way you appear to others, something they sense before you even speak. The radiance of radical composure. There is a phenomenon that every person of experience has observed, but few have been able to name precisely. In a room under pressure, a difficult negotiation, a family crisis, a moment of organizational chaos, there is always one person whose stillness functions like a fixed point, not because they are doing anything visible, not because they have the loudest voice or the most obvious authority, but because their composure creates a gravitational center that everyone else instinctively orients toward. You have felt this. You have probably been in rooms where one person's calm was so tangible it physically changed the atmosphere. And you have likely also been in rooms where one person's anxiety was so contagious it destabilized people who walked in perfectly steady. Composure is not neutral. It is active. It radiates. And at a neurological level, the people around you are registering your internal state, continuously adjusting their own behavior, their trust in your judgment, and their perception of your authority in direct response to what your nervous system is broadcasting. This is why the person who remains still when everything is moving does not need to claim leadership. It is assigned to them automatically, by the room, by the moment, by the biological wiring of every human being present who is looking for something stable to anchor to. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should keep the soul in a state of tranquility, undistracted by the noise of those around us. He understood that composure is not a response to favorable circumstances. It is a discipline maintained regardless of circumstances, and that distinction is everything. Anyone can appear calm when nothing is at stake. The person who remains composed when the stakes are highest is the person the room remembers. At this point in your life, you have earned the right to be that person, not through performance, not through suppression, but through the genuine internal architecture of someone who has done the work. The composure you carry into a room is the most permanent and transferable form of authority available to you. But there is one deeply held cultural belief that quietly undermines all of it, and almost everyone past 40 has internalized it without realizing the cost: the disconnection between sweat and stress. There is a belief so deeply embedded in the working culture of the last several decades that most people have never examined it as a belief at all. They simply experience it as reality. The belief is this: that the intensity of your effort should be visible in your state of agitation, that if you are not stressed, you are not serious, that exhaustion is evidence of commitment, and calm is evidence of complacency. This belief has cost you more than you know, not because hard work is wrong, but because the layer of mental tension that most people add on top of their work is not the work itself. It is friction. It is the worry about whether the work will be enough, the replaying of what was said in the last meeting, the background hum of self-judgment running simultaneously with every task. That layer does not improve the output. It degrades it, and it depletes the person producing it in ways that rest alone cannot repair. Think of the professionals at the highest levels of any demanding field: surgeons, senior negotiators, the people who perform precisely when the consequences are most serious. What distinguishes them is not that they care more. It is that they have learned to separate the intensity of their focus from the agitation of their nervous system. They work with complete commitment and absolute internal stillness simultaneously. The effort is real. The stress is absent. And that combination produces a quality of output and a quality of presence that anxiety-driven effort simply cannot match. Seneca wrote that some people wander without purpose, calling their restlessness activity, when it is nothing more than a failure of self-command. True productivity is not the volume of motion. It is the precision of directed effort, applied from a state of internal equilibrium. At this stage of your life, you do not need to prove your commitment through visible strain. You have earned the right to work with the quiet intensity of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why it matters, without the performance of stress that younger, less certain people rely on to signal their seriousness. The most powerful version of your effort does not look exhausted. It looks inevitable. And that quality of presence begins with how you treat the one resource that no amount of effort can replace: the capital of imperturbable time. At this point in your life, time is no longer abstract. You feel its weight differently than you did at 30. You make calculations now, not consciously, not always in words, but in the way you respond to waste, differently than you once did. The hour spent in a pointless argument, the afternoon consumed by a spiral of worry about something that resolved itself by morning, the mental energy given to a provocation that, in the clearest part of your judgment, you already knew did not deserve it. These are not just emotional experiences, they are withdrawals from a finite account. And the compounding cost of those withdrawals, measured not in money, but in the quality of thought, the depth of presence, the clarity of the decisions that will shape the years ahead, is something that most people do not calculate until they can no longer afford to ignore it. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Life is long enough, he said, if it is well invested. The question is not whether you have enough time. The question is what you are purchasing with the time you have. when you master the discipline of imperturbable attention, when you stop allowing urgency to be manufactured by external noise and start deciding for yourself what genuinely merits your focus, the quality of the hours available to you changes fundamentally. A single hour of undistracted, emotionally steady work produces more than a week of fragmented, anxiety-driven effort, not because the hour is longer, but because the person inhabiting it is fully present. This is not a productivity strategy. It is a reclamation of the only thing that cannot be earned back once it is gone. Every minute you protect from unnecessary reaction, from manufactured urgency, from the slow drain of habitual rumination, is a minute that goes toward the life you are still building, the relationships, the work, and the version of yourself that these years were always meant to produce. The way you spend your attention is the way you spend your life, and how you see the world around you is determined entirely by the quality of the mind you bring to it. The phenomenon of reality mirroring. There is a realization that arrives differently for everyone, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a single moment of undeniable clarity, that the world you have been experiencing is not a fixed external reality, operating independently of you. It is, to a far greater degree than most people are comfortable admitting, a reflection of the internal state you bring to it. This is not mysticism. It is the practical observation of anyone who has lived long enough to see the same external circumstances produce radically different outcomes depending on the person navigating them. Two people face the same professional setback. One sees a confirmation of their worst fears and contracts. The other sees information and adjusts. The setback was identical. The reality each person then inhabits, in the months that follow, is entirely different, shaped not by what happened, but by the mind that met it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that things stand outside of us, themselves, by themselves, neither knowing anything of themselves, nor expressing any judgment. It is we who give them their meaning. The wall in front of you is only as large as the story your mind constructs around it. And a mind clouded by anxiety, resentment, or chronic reactivity will consistently construct walls larger than the ones that actually exist. When you cultivate genuine internal stillness, your perception changes structurally, not because the circumstances improve. They may not, but because the lens through which you view them is no longer distorted by the static of a nervous system in constant defense mode. Obstacles that were genuinely blocking you reveal themselves, under a clear-eyed examination, to be smaller and more navigable than they appeared. People who seemed adversarial turn out to be simply reactive. Situations that felt permanent reveal their temporary nature. You stop fighting the reflection and start correcting the source. And when that shift happens, when you stop projecting your internal noise onto the circumstances of your life, the path forward becomes visible with a clarity that feels, to everyone watching, like wisdom. It is wisdom, the kind that only comes from a mind disciplined enough to see clearly, and it leads to the only realization that makes everything else in this conversation complete: the triumph of sovereign silence. You have spent years trying to manage the external world, trying to arrange enough of the right conditions so that peace would finally be available to you as a reward. Enough security, enough recognition, enough resolved situations. And at this point in your life, you likely already know, at some level, that it does not work that way. The conditions are never fully resolved. The recognition is never entirely sufficient. The security always has another threshold to cross. What the Stoics understood, and what takes most people decades of direct experience to confirm, is that peace is not the destination. It is the instrument. It is not what you achieve after you have handled everything. It is the internal state from which you handle everything effectively. The person waiting for calm to arrive as a consequence of favorable circumstances will wait indefinitely. The person who cultivates calm as a deliberate practice, independent of circumstances, discovers that they have been carrying the thing they were searching for the entire time. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind free from passions is a citadel, that a person has nothing stronger to take refuge in, and from which they remain forever unconquerable. He was not describing a theoretical ideal. He was describing a practice he returned to every single day, under the weight of an empire, in the middle of catastrophe, without the option of retreat. At this point in your life, you do not need to start over. You need to start correctly, with the full weight of everything you have already survived, every lesson that cost you something real to learn, and the clear-eyed recognition that the years still ahead are too valuable to be spent reacting to things that were never worth your best energy. Sovereign silence is not withdrawal. It is not passivity. It is the condition of a person who has stopped needing the world's noise to feel alive, who has found, in the stillness of their own mind, something more durable than approval, more reliable than circumstances, and more powerful than anything they could say out loud. The chaos will continue. The world will keep producing provocations in quantities you will never exhaust. None of that changes. What changes is you, and the foundational decision you make today to stop being moved by what was never worthy of your movement. You are the stillness in the storm. Go forward, and let the room feel it.